Thanks, Jim. Well, I'm actually the one that's listening tonight throughout the entire broadcast what you're saying. And in fact, in the last couple of weeks, we put this out there. We asked the community on social media, what is race and where we've come in the last 50 years in St. Louis? And we've been hearing from you throughout the last few weeks and tonight. In fact, we've been hearing things like being careful of talking about race versus racism. And one tweet from STL Rocks said there's still work to be done. And that's what we're doing tonight. So there's two ways you can join in the conversation. One way is to log on to our Facebook page. We put a question there earlier this afternoon. Go on there on the 9 Network page and comment on that. Give us your feedback. Or you can actually use Twitter by using the hashtag StayTunedSTL. Let's see what you're already saying.
Well, we're going to try to answer some of those questions that Ed just brought up that you have on Twitter. And to help us do that, we're going to have our first table here. Let me do some introductions here first, starting with Vetta Thompson from Washington University, leading researcher in race and diversity. Also with us is Thomas Harvey, Arch City Defenders, providing legal services to people who are marginalized in our community largely. And Kira Hudson Banks, thanks for coming back to the show, St. Louis University Assistant Professor of Psychology. Also, you work in workplace diversity and other issues around tonight's topic. But before we get started here, we talked about looking back. We're also going to look forward tonight. Let's start this conversation off with some perspectives from some young St. Louisans.
So to me, like, race is just, I guess, how people perceive you, like on like face value, like this is the race that you are.
When your race, you walk into your job, okay? They're gonna look at you in a certain way. They're gonna look at your race. I may come in there and say I'm yellow, but they're gonna look at me and say you're African American, you're black, so you're gonna be treated this way.
I'm originally from Mexico, so I see it a little different. To me, race is just a classification that separates the differences of physical looks.
In our generation, we're just coming out of an era where people didn't talk about anything. Mm-hmm. Talking about things like race and sexuality it was not okay to talk about that. And so I feel like we're still kind of, we're being raised by that generation.
Now we don't have to go out and march and kill people and things like that. It's not what we need. What we do need is just to be more sensitive about the fact that we have other different people here in America.
And there will always be people that say that racism does not exist, but it's because we don't talk about it. It's something that's not talked about.
For about as long as we've been on the air with Stay Tuned, this has been a topic that you have wanted us to tackle. A lot of times people say this is a hard thing to talk about. Is this a hard conversation? Why is this so difficult to talk about, or is it not?
I think race is hard to talk about because we have a history of racism in our society. So we have a history of treating people differently based on their race, whether it's citizenship or housing, and there are so many ways in which we've treated people differently. And so we don't like to talk about that legacy. It's uncomfortable when we see it happening all around us.
I think the other reason it can be very difficult is because if we have a serious conversation and we admit the extent to which our institutions and social and legal structures have been influenced by this, and we admit that these things need to change, it means that the balance of power and privilege would also have to change. And I'm not sure everyone is committed to that at this point. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, to even think about that maybe, just maybe, where I am is not solely predicated on everything that I've done and I've accomplished. those are hard things to wrestle with.
But you know what's interesting? If we think about other models of other countries, Germany, right, with Nazi Germany, they've actually made a commitment as a country to never forget. And so they talk about their history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust so that it stays alive in people's minds to not let it happen, whereas we don't like to talk about our history.
What's even more interesting is that we probably have as much to wrestle with as Germany does, because we had a eugenics movement that was quite strong at the time that World War II broke out. As soon as we entered, we erased that from the national consciousness. You do not hear Americans talking about the eugenics movement that took place, where based on race, based on sexual orientation, based on any number of factors, we were doing many of the things that Germany was talking about. So we've got a lot to wrestle with.
Yeah, and that's the place where the young lady that was talking about race being a classification system, she's right, and we have a history of doing that in our country, right? But it's not just the classification system. It has to do with access and power and privilege, and I think it's really important to realize that race, we've constructed it. It's a social construct, and it's bogus in the sense that we actually have more difference within race than across race.
From the biological standpoint.
So
But it means a
what
lot.
is the definition? We heard on the tweet there, but don't mix up race and racism. How do you define race for tonight's conversation?
Race is, for the way that I typically will explain it, race is a term, a construct borrowed from biology. From that standpoint, we have no evidence that race exists as a classification system for human beings. But race is a social construct. We have used it as a major organizing principle, deciding who is positioned where in our society for over a century now. And so as a social reality, it does exist, and we have to deal with it that way.
And one of the ways it comes into play, I think it's most interesting, it was sort of highlighted in the clip, is institutional racism versus individual racism. There's some studies that suggest that younger folks view racism in two different ways depending on where they fit in the spectrum. Young people of color view racism as an institutional issue. And they see that reflected in the courts and with the police and the schools and healthcare and throughout a broad spectrum of their life. Younger people who are in the majority see it as an individual action, and it's kind of a colloquialism, but we're past the point where the Ku Klux Klan is burning crosses on the lawn. That's not our only indicator that there's racism that exists in America. We're at a place where it's become ingrained in the fabric of our institutions to where it's almost invisible without a further sort of investigation of those institutions.
We have the laws that were passed in the 1960s. Where is our institutional racism now?
I was really intrigued by that piece, because I think if you look at we talked about this a little bit before the show, the idea of like looking back and showing where we started and then trying to measure where we are today. If you think about race in America, it goes back, it's ingrained in our Constitution. It's there from the very founding documents of our country. And then we have this steady, I mean, that continues through roughly the mid-50s, 1960s, where we have this one moment in our entire history where we say, that's wrong, we should do this, we should do something about this. And from that moment forward, if you go to the 1980s, there's sort of a slow but steady and continuing rolling back of those protections. Even the racial discrimination side, the laws that Mr. Green was talking about, that he's part of that case, Jim mentioned it, it must be an overwhelming anecdotal evidence of discrimination. That's just been harder and harder and harder to prove. So we had this one moment in time where the laws were strong, and then they've kind of declined.
And I think you see it unfortunately, in our criminal justice system, in our education system, in terms of even our healthcare system. There have been studies around the field of medicine in terms of who gets the most pain medication, in terms of people believing that they're actually in pain, or who gets the most comprehensive scans in terms of the healthcare. And it's not, I would really like to say, it's not about finding who the bad apples are and who is racist. It's more about seeing what are the norms and how are our institutions set up that kind of guide us to treating different groups of people differently. differently.
And it's really about how we understand what racism, what discrimination is. We have this view that it is the Klan marching and burning things and people bombing houses. But it is more than that. It is when you show favoritism to the in-group and you are overly critical of the out-group, and there is a great deal of that. So if you look at policing, if a young African-American male is there and he's walking late at night, he must be a criminal, must be committing a crime, watch him. If it's a young white male, oh, do you need any help? Are you lost? Did your car break down? I mean, it's a very different attitude, and that bias is ingrained. We have made status of being African or Latino or something bad, and white is synonymous with good, and we act that out in many ways.
Thank you all. This is a great start to tonight's conversation. We appreciate it. Let's go back to social media.